So welcome back to Food for Sustainability webinars. My name is Claudia Costa. I'm responsible for the Food for Sustainability Academy, and I will be guiding this session today. So this afternoon we'll be talking about regenerative agriculture with a session entitled The Ups and Downs of Regenerative Agriculture. With us we have a distinguished panel members, which I thank truly their presence, and they will bring us the academic perspective represented here by Wageningen University, by NECAR, which is the Basque Institute for Agriculture Research and Development, and at the European level we will hear about the role that EIT Food has been playing towards promoting regenerative practices. With me, I also have the team that works hard to prepare these sessions, which I will briefly introduce and kindly ask to switch your cameras. So Rita Silva, a microbiologist. Hi, Rita.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Rita. Daniela Fonseca, a biochemistry PhD. Hello, Daniela. And Silvia Moreira, not only our Regi, but our food science, technology and nutrition PhD. Hello, Sylvia. They all make our byproduct valorization team, and they are here to assist you throughout this session and with any future questions that you might have about the webinars or about Food for Sustainability itself. So before we proceed, just a short note on our house rules. Questions are welcome, right, Daniela? So Daniela, can you let us know how can the audience take part if they wish?
Yes, absolutely. You just need to go to the chat and place your questions. We will try to answer to each one of your questions at the end of each one of the speakers' presentations. If there is not enough time, we will take them at the end of the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniela. Let me also remind you that today's session, as all webinars, are one and a half hours long. Also that this session is being recorded to all those that wish to access our webinars at a later stage. Rita, how can our participants access recording?
Yeah. The session will be available in our website, and I will put I put in chat the link for you can access.
Thank you, Rita. So please keep your cameras off if you do not wish to appear in the recording. Okay, so before starting, let me just share that regenerative practices are central to Food for Sustainability. So working towards more sustainable farming systems for us are the stepping stone to more safe and healthy food production. Food for Sustainability has ongoing projects relating this topic, such as our EIT Food Grow workshops. We also currently have an Erasmus program, Erasmus Plus program called Transformers, which touches on regenerative practices on almond and olive. And we also do soil microbiome and genetic analysis to establish the best bacterial and fungi consortia towards more healthy soils. So if you want to know a little bit more about these projects, you can either check our website or just drop us a line later on. We will be delighted to talk to you a little bit more about these projects. Okay, so let's start by reviewing some figures to contextualize the challenges of regenerative agriculture. And I will do this by starting by sharing my screen, which hopefully you will see. Let me just get a bit technical. Can you see my screen? Is it?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Let me just have something here on my computer. Apologies. My computer just decided to have on live all of the sudden.
We can see
So-
the presentation perfectly.
It's just that I have loads of notifications appearing and I cannot see my presentation, but I think it's fine. So let me start in that showing some figures about agriculture itself. We all know that the data is quite clear. So the agricultural system has a significant environmental footprint. It is associated approximately to 1/3 of the global land use and is a key driver of land use change globally, which of course has severe effects on several biodiversity topics. Therefore, biodiversity is at the forefront of regenerative agriculture. Furthermore, the entire food production value chain has been estimated to produce around 50% of the total global gas emissions. So the current practices, they trigger negative effects on the ecosystem, and which of course affect our fauna, the soil, water, air, and increase the susceptibility of crops to pests. So we can say that the 20th century model for agriculture has been very successful in terms of efficiency, in terms of producing food that can feed the entire population, but this has come at the expense of the destruction of part of our natural environments. And faced with this scenario, a lot of researchers and people looking at this issue have called for a rewriting on a new narrative for agriculture. And one of these narratives is what we call regenerative agriculture. And interesting that there is still no single definition for regenerative agriculture, although the term was first coined by an American, Robert Rodale. And it is in fact an agriculture system that practices the principles that support biodiversity, that enrich soil and its functionality, that come to improve, namely, water quality, carbon soil retention, which can contribute to adaptation to global warming. And we really hope that will assist us at reversing this global warming. So we have all these energies while still working to rehabilitate the agriculture system. So regenerative agriculture puts us on a path that brings together nature, climate, people, and animals in synergy. Okay, regenerative agriculture is based on 5 principles. The first one is to minimize soil disturbance, thus limit tillage, minimize the use of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. As we all know, pesticides and herbicides destroy soil microbiome, they disrupt plant activity, and this of course has very negative impacts on the environment, mainly because it prevents its good functioning. Furthermore, by limiting mobilization, we also minimize the disturbance on the soil ecosystem. Plant roots remain in the soil. They can be enhancing the microbial activity in processes that transform the nutrients and accumulate carbon. So by protecting the soil surface, we are also increasing water retention while limiting soil erosion. And, a very common problem here in the Mediterranean region, we are preventing desertification. At the same time, by maximizing crop diversity, implementing intercropping and rotations, also integrating animals as part of the system, we are raising a richer soil and also contributing to soil health, and thus its functionality. So these are basically the foundation for regenerative agriculture, which I'm sure that our first speaker will definitely complement. So with these practices, regenerative agriculture can actually regenerate soil quality, but can go a little bit further than that because it retains carbon in the soil, reducing greenhouse emissions. So in this holistic perspective, soil cover, perennial plants, composting, mulching, among others, increase the carbon retained by plants in the soil, resulting in less carbon release to the ecosystem and more carbon fixed in crops. So altogether, this practice are carbon-rich practices that enrich soil or organic matter, with the result that we can have vital microbes proliferating, roots going deeper, plants having better intake of nutrients, better water retention, plants that are more resistant, and soil fertility increasing. And the potentials of regenerative agriculture have been laid down by the Drown Down project, highlighting that regenerative agriculture enhances and sustains the health of the soil by restoring its carbon content. And they have achieved a figure between 14.5 and 22 gigatons of carbon dioxide that can be sequestrated from the atmosphere by 2015. So, and it's against this background that agriculture might be facing a crisis, that as we have from all the EU reports that our soils are in poor health, with researchers pointing that biodiversity might be facing the sixth mass extinction, crop yieldings plateauing, that we need to start to look to different narratives towards agriculture. And the interesting thing is that despite the widespread interest in regenerative agriculture, we still have no legal definition of the term regenerative agriculture, nor a definition has emerged that can be of common usage. So today's webinar will try to answer these questions. So what is regenerative agriculture and why is it gaining such prominence? Which problems does it solve and how does it solve it? So let's start this webinar by welcome Loki Schreier, which I'll briefly introduce to you before I give the floor to Loki. I don't know if I just probably like this is better. So Loki, good afternoon. So Loki's research focuses on transitioning towards regenerative agriculture. Loki was born in the Netherlands, where he graduated from the University of Applied Science with a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. It's very interesting. The focus of his bachelor's thesis was the design of circular large-scale production systems to produce housefly larvae for feed. His master's degree was obtained at Wageningen University and research in biosystems engineering, where he continued to study edible insects. Since 2018, Loki has been working on his PhD at the Top Institute for Food Nutrition on the Regenerative Farming Project. And this project aims to bring together scientists, farmers' organizations, and food chain companies together to identify the characteristics of regenerative agriculture and works towards its implementation in 2050. Loki, I welcome you to our webinars. I now give the floor to you. You have your mic muted, Loki.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia, for the introduction. That is very nice. Maybe my internet connection is already unstable. Therefore, I asked Anna to to share a video where I actually present what I wanted to tell in this webinar. So if Anna can start up the video, that would be helpful.
Anna, you have Loki's
and
video?
and I shared the video. Loki, sorry.
Great.
Okay. If you can't hear the video, tell me please, but I think that it's okay.
Hello everybody, my name is Loki Schrevel and I'm a PhD candidate at the Wageningen University, and today I want to tell you something about my PhD, which is about regenerative agriculture. So my PhD is part of a larger project, which is called the Regenerative Farming Project in the Netherlands, and there's a large amount of stakeholders involved in contributing to this project, in which we had a really big discussion at the beginning of the project about what is meant with regenerative agriculture. Because there was actually a lot of confusion. These different stakeholders had all a different opinion about regenerative agriculture, and in the end we decided we need to do a review about what's actually meant with regenerative agriculture. But even in the scientific literature we found there's actually not one uniform definition, because even in these definitions from the scientific literature there was a lot of divergence. So what we tried in our study, in our review, is to find a level of convergence between these different definitions. And this resulted in different categorizations or themes which define regenerative agriculture. And you can see these themes here. These themes we try to further elaborate on to say, okay, what can we see in these themes? So one thing became clear, these themes represent both objectives and activities which all define regenerative agriculture. Next, we also found that these themes, or all these definitions, were sometimes focused on the farm level and sometimes more focused on higher scales, so towards the food systems level. And the next thing is these themes relate to different dimensions of sustainable food production. So we see that actually there's a large number of different themes focused on the environment with a specific focus on the soil. Therefore, we also created a new pillar, which is called the soil, because most of the themes are actually related to the soil. Then next, we also found themes which were related to the social and economic aspects of sustainable food production. But you can see there's only one theme for each. This does not mean that these are unimportant in regenerative agriculture, because between brackets you can now see the number of articles referring to a theme, and this is actually still quite high for the social and economic aspects. The reason why we couldn't create underlying themes is because there was a lot of divergence within these themes. So for example, only one article mentioned animal welfare in the definition of regenerative agriculture. But actually this whole article was focused on animal welfare within the regenerative agriculture, but therefore, because in the other articles animal welfare was not mentioned, we couldn't create underlying themes. So from this review we were able to propose a definition for regenerative agriculture based on the convergence of these other definitions, and that is that regenerative agriculture is a farming approach that in the first place uses the soil as the basis, tries to regenerate and contribute to multiple ecosystem services, and enhances not only the environmental but also the social and economic dimensions of sustainable food production. So after publishing this article we received a lot of comments, and some said, well, if you are new for regenerative agriculture, this is a study which really helps as a dot on the horizon for people unfamiliar with regenerative agriculture. But we also received some criticism. This was especially because of farmers, because they said, yeah, I think it's also really nice, but it's for us really unclear how we can contribute to regenerative agriculture, because these objectives and activities are not equally relevant for every context or farming system. And we agreed on that, so we tried to continue this study and see, can we develop a modeling framework or something that shows a farmer which regenerative objectives are suboptimal, and help to suggest practices to actually work towards regenerative agriculture in the local context. So then we started a study. We first picked the regenerative objectives relevant at the farm level, again within the People, Planet, Profit framework. And we now know the soil is the base in regenerative agriculture, so we centralized the soil. Then we looked for models, because these give a systematic approach to the assessment and redesign of farming systems, which could assess these regenerative objectives. But we were not able to find one model who could do it. We needed a combination of models for this assessment. So we used the Soil Navigator as a soil model, which could assess 5 different soil functions, showing quite nice convergence with the regenerative objectives. And we used Farm Design as a bioeconomic model, which could assess different indicators, different environmental indicators, but also farm profitability and farm labor. So these indicators we used in our study, but there are actually many other indicators which these models can calculate. But of course, for time and resources, we, but also other researchers, cannot, of course, use all these indicators. So we acknowledge that there are probably other models who could give an assessment on these themes of regenerative agriculture, but we choose these models specifically because the Soil Navigator cannot only show which soil functions are performing at a suboptimal capacity, but also suggests specific management practices to improve on these regenerative objectives. And these practices we can then incorporate into farm design. And farm design does not show only one farm future for this farming system, which often happens, but actually shows solution spaces. So a multitude of different farm configurations working in different extents towards the objectives of regenerative agriculture. So from this study, we now know that using this modeling framework, we can simultaneously assess multiple regenerative objectives at the local context, but also help to redesign farms towards a mode of regenerative agriculture. And we published this in Agricultural Systems. But of course, this is still a really theoretical story, and now you probably want to know what kind of result does this framework actually deliver, and what can we do with this kind of result. So we are now working on a second study in which we are applying this modeling framework on 3 typical Dutch farms, and try to see what kind of result this modeling framework gives and how we can actually utilize this. So today I want to discuss briefly our Arbo case study farm, which is quite a conventional farm, has quite an intensive crop rotation, uses potato, sugar beet, uses pesticides, artificial fertilizers and slurry. And the Soil Navigator enabled us to show what kind of practices we should use on the farm or should use not. So it suggested to avoid the use of pesticides and mine fertilizers, incorporate solid manure, reduce total end fertilization, incorporate catch crops, and return crop residues back to the soil. Using these practices also into farm design, what I already told you, enables us to create solution spaces. And how does these solution spaces look like? They look like this. So this is a figure which we try at the one hand to improve also organic matter surplus, but at the other hand try to reduce pesticide use. And then you see an orange dot. This represents the original farm configuration, so how the farm is performing now. And then we see two clouds of solutions, a black cloud and a blue cloud. And today we only focus on the black clouds. And this black cloud shows alternative farm configurations which in different extents work towards the objectives of regenerative agriculture. And these clouds, the solutions in these clouds are varying because the model can apply different management. So it can choose. So for example, there are solutions here in which 10 hectares of conventional potato is used, where we can still use pesticides. But in other solutions, the dominant factor is, for example, regenerative sugar beet. So therefore you see that there are different farm configurations. So we can create these solution clouds for actually all the indicators of farm design. And this really helps, I think, farmers to create perspective, to understand what practices help or help not towards different regenerative objectives. Because these objectives can have relationships with each other. For example, here you see a relationship between the soil organic matter surplus and operating profit. If you want to increase your soil organic matter surplus, this goes not well with also increasing operating profit, because the more we increase soil organic matter surplus, how also our farm profitability reduces. And I think these kind of things is really nice to show to farmers, that there are consequences of using different management. And for research, it's of course really interesting to find out, okay, what is actually causing such a trade-off. And in this case, it is the solutions with a higher soil organic matter surplus are also implementing a lot more of the regenerative practices. So they use more solid manure, bring more crop residues back to the soil, with of course all increased soil organic matter surplus, but also avoid the use of pesticides more. And this leads within the first 5 years, especially in the Netherlands, to reduce crop yields, but also operating profit. So if you look overall to these cloud solutions, we actually see that these clouds are all outperforming the reference configurations. We can have more soil organic matter surplus, less pesticides, less imported fertilizers, etc. But only for operating profit, we actually see quite a large body of alternative farm configurations which have a lower farm profitability compared to the reference. And this is something that is really to acknowledge or to consider for a farmer when applying regenerative management. So the next thing, of course, the farmer or other stakeholders will be interested in, they say, well, okay, nice, we can see that there's so much room for maneuver for a farmer to apply regenerative management and see the consequences on his regenerative objectives. But what happens if you select different of these farm configurations? What's the effect on these regenerative objectives? So what we can actually do in this modeling framework is select every individual farm configuration, and then it shows you the performance on different objectives of regenerative agriculture. So for example, we selected different configurations, 3 configurations, and here you can see that they all have a different performance on the objectives of regenerative agriculture. And overall, if you go more to the right, the bars, the more regenerative management is applied. So overall, we can see that environmental sustainability improves, and you can see that in the biodiversity, in the water purification, in climate regulation. But we also see that the more we go to regenerative management, for this case study farm profitability reduces. And this is something which could really hinder the transition towards regenerative agriculture. So from this study, we show that farmers can choose between different farm futures, but we also show, and that's not only for this case study farm, but also for the others, that overall farm profitability reduced. And therefore we really argue and recommend that business models must change to value different regenerative objectives or ecosystem services, that farmers can both contribute to these regenerative objectives, but still have a viable business model. And then we come to my last slide of this presentation. These are my takeaway messages from my presentation, and that is in regenerative agriculture, I think we really should use the soil as the base. Tailor-made solutions are key for every farmer in the transition process. There are no silver bullets anymore, or one-fits-all solutions. And we need to give farmers a perspective, not say there's only one solution, but show them that there's room for maneuver. And thereby I want to leave it, and I hope we still have some time for some questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Loki, for such a great presentation. and for presenting us such a comprehensive and detailed study on the attempt to model regenerative agriculture. And also thank you for providing a definition and a review of what regenerative agriculture really is. It was very interesting. So while our audience gets their questions ready, I will take this time just to clarify some aspects of your research. So you pointed out that that the soil is at the heart of regenerative agriculture. We also know that a good and balanced microbiome makes the soil more resilient and eventually self-sufficient. So when you claim that regenerative agriculture is not going to be profitable, can't this be challenged by the factor time? So my question is, how is your model accounting for the variable time?
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. This is a really relevant question, what you're saying. But first, I want to clarify something first. The modeling we did and why we see reduced profitability is only for these farming systems. So there are many examples of farming systems or farming systems which claim to be regenerative and actually manage to have a viable business model while contributing to many regenerative objectives. And these are called positive deviance or lighthouse farms, sometimes they are called. But we have a lot of these farms also in our project, but often, these work in a really, in their local context. They work often in a niche, have a really exceptional market orientation. But if you, I used conventional farms that really show that these lighthouse farms or positive deviance, their strategy is not always to be implemented by other farms. So this reduced farm profitability is really for this farming system, but could be different for other farming system. The point you raised is that I modeled in a 5-year time horizon, and therefore we saw indeed reduced farm profitability. But I also think, and actually we are right now writing a paper on this, if you used a longer time horizon, like 10 years or 15 years, the positive effects of regenerative agriculture actually might be seen. For example, the soil organic matter surplus, the effects of regenerative management are often not seen within 5 years, but in 10 or 15 years. And these really contribute to the resilience and increase of crop yields, which you will not probably see within the first 5 years.
Okay, so you actually enter in you enter a 5 time period, which is normally the sort of what we call the valley of death for farmers, for transitioning this system. But it's also actually very interesting, your results, because and probably you are aware of studies that were published in California for almonds, comparing regenerative with conventional, and the studies show more profitability. Productivity decreased, but in terms of, because the factor of the inputs and the possibility to sell the production at higher price makes the farmer far more profitable.
Yeah, so that is good to acknowledge. We used the same product prices as conventional farmers, so we didn't put a price premium. That's why we see also this reduced profitability, and we argue if you can actually give a price premium or some kind of subsidies or credits to the valuation of these different regenerative objectives, probably the study will change, this operating profit. We did used reduced input costs because we reduce imported fertilizers and reduce pesticide use. However, this did not lead in overall increased farm profitability.
Okay. It's interesting. It also draws on the probably on the Dutch system, which is probably very intensive from the beginning. So regenerative practices might also take long to produce their effects. That's very interesting, Lockie. And your paper is definitely worthwhile reading in more detail. I have so many more questions that I don't want to bother our audience with too many details. I have a question from the audience. Lockie, in your perspective, what is hindering farmers to adopt more regenerative practices?
Yeah, good question. There's actually a really nice paper of Gosnell about this, about the barriers of regenerative agriculture. But what we see from my perspective in my project, it is the valuation of these regenerative objectives. Farmers want to make an earning, they want to earn their bread. And currently in the Netherlands, it's like, yeah, if they, especially in this transition period, when they stop using pesticides, they don't get really a price premium yet for their produce, although they do have reduced yield values and therefore take a higher risk. So I think the main problem is the profitability of the farm. They really see reduced profitability.
That's interesting. One of the concerns that we also hear a lot in Portugal is lack of knowledge and knowing where to search for sources of knowledge to start implementing these new practices. But definitely, you know, the economic aspect should always come first. We also have Philippe asking if the models are applicable for smaller scale farms, and would they be applicable for other soil systems such as forests?
Yeah, good question. We can model with the farm design model actually all kind of farms, also forests, silver pastures, etc. With the Soil Navigator, this is more difficult because it works on a field level, and currently it's calibrated for different European countries. I'm not sure if Portugal is one of them, but I think Spain is, and it works on a field level. So we can be really specific in a recommendation of specific regenerative practices.
Okay, so it works also for other systems. Okay. Good. Okay, I have one more question for you. So when you started to define regenerative agriculture, you highlighted the economic and the social aspects, and one of the main takeaways was that regenerative agriculture is in need of new business models to make this practice a mainstream practice. So, in your view, how could the new CAP, the new agricultural policy, fix this operating profitability dilemma that you so well brought here to us? So currently what we see is those that pollute don't pay anything, and those that contribute, that they have positive synergies to the environment, they don't receive anything for it. Do you think that the new CAP might play some role in these new business models?
I think they definitely can, but this is really difficult because I think really for the valuation of regenerative agriculture, we need to have a combination of practice-based and research-based indicators to really measure the effects of regenerative agriculture. What you have seen with organic agriculture, they use practice-based indicators to value if a farmer is organic or not. But often these practices are poorly correlated with the goal of organic agriculture. And now what we see with regenerative agriculture is that often people talk about result indicators. So if a farm really has a higher organic matter due to his practices, you give him a price premium, or you give him subsidies, or there are multiple methods to actually compensate the farmer for the efforts. However, many of these indicators, you can only see the effects on the long term. If you talk about organic matter or biodiversity, you can only see the differences of the practices used in 5, 10, or 15 years. But what you already mentioned, the difficult period, the transition period, is within this first 5 years, where you probably or maybe have reduced yields, so also reduced profit, but also you don't see still the effects of your regenerative practices. So yeah, this is not a straightforward answer, but I think what the CAP is saying could help, but it still needs a lot of discussion.
And probably we also need to balance here the public incentive schemes to bring this sorts of issues more, you know, the incentivize farmers towards a longer term approach, and probably they need to have those monetary incentives. We have a couple of more questions here. So Richard just says that conventional farms are designed for extractive agriculture using lots of inputs. If the design is the same and some regenerative agricultural practice implemented, then it can't really be regenerative. Neither it can be profitable unless the whole design is redone. For example, introducing livestock on farms that have none, staging business instead of just 1 or 2 streams of income, etc. Is this envisioned in the regenerative agriculture approach in the Netherlands?
What do you actually mean? I missed the concrete question.
Okay, so basically, Richard is asking that regenerative practice is a more holistic view of agriculture. So you stop looking at agriculture just from the extractive perspective, but you also start to reintegrate other approaches. Okay, and the question is if you have envisaged these other approaches in the Netherlands.
So there's no framework in the Netherlands yet to really help farmers towards regenerative agriculture. But the modeling framework we just presented can actually help with this. So you can do a complete farm redesign, because I agree there are also many other farming approaches like circular agriculture, in which you can tweak only your resource management. But in regenerative agriculture, it's about a radical redesign. So I agree that only limiting your imported fertilizers, that will not help you towards really all the goals of regenerative agriculture. You need to have really a food systems approach for that. And this study is on the farm level, but actually, if you want to truly work towards regenerative agriculture, I think you need to also have studies more on a regional scale, also taking, for example, consumption into account.
Yes, it makes all sense. So this is part of a bigger problem. It's all a systematic approach, because there are here different pieces that are intertwined. Loki, I wonder if you can stay with us until the end of the webinar. I'm just going to give the floor to our next speakers, but in case we have more time, we'll go back to you and to the other speakers. Okay, so thank you so much, Loki, for your views. We'll now be moving to our second guest, Neria Mandalunis. I hope I pronounced it right, from NECAR, which is the Basque Institute for Agricultural Research and Development. Neria will be presenting regenerative grazing management, environment and health benefits. But let me just briefly introduce you to Neria first. So Neria is a PhD in veterinary sciences, and she's a researcher on animal production department of NECAR since 2007. She has led and participated in projects funded by local, national and international calls. Her work is focused on the study of the interactions between livestock and natural resources, mainly on grazing-based systems and regenerative practices, the interaction of production systems with product quality and the analysis of the ecosystem services provided by pasture-based livestock systems and the use of innovative technologies for livestock territorial management, such as virtual fencing. Welcome, Neria. Thank you so much. And I'll now give the floor to you. I believe you can share your screen. Great, we can see your screen. All is working well. The floor is yours, Neria. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia, and all the group for inviting us to this webinar. As you have told before, NAICAR is the Basque Institute of Agricultural Research and Development, and we are in the north of Spain. The Basque Country, where we are located, have a surface of 7,000 kilometers square and a density of 300 habitats per kilometer square. So one of the positive aspects of these conditions is that farmers are next to the consumers, but the negative aspect is that farmers have some difficulties to access to land, both for buying or for renting. In the case of the extensive livestock farming system here in the Basque Country, traditionally has been based on beef cattle and dairy sheep systems with local breeds, and traditionally all those systems have been based on grazing in the spring and autumn in valley and during summer period in mountain conditions, as you can see in the pictures. We are talking all the time about permanent pastures in our conditions, and as pastures have a huge role in the provision of the ecosystem services, one of the main challenges for us with our farmers is how to convince them to change the continuous grazing management to this regenerative grazing management, because we know that the continuous grazing management have some characteristics like the animals make selection in the land, both in the horizontal and the vertical aspect, and this involves an infragrazing areas and undergrazing other ones. On the other hand, the regenerative grazing avoids all these selections and make an homogeneous use of all the land. So under these conditions, how to start with the regenerative grazing management? How can we encourage our farmers? There are three main keys. The first one is to divide the paddocks in smaller plots. The second key is to put high stocking rates in these small plots in short periods of time. And the third key, and the most important, is to give enough resting time for pasture and for soil to recover after the disturbance of the grazing activity. And how can we do this? We do this with the grazing plan or the grazing calendars. With those calendars, we avoid selection of the animals and we enhance the positive aspects of the regenerative grazing. And what do we need to do to start with this? First of all, we need to adjust the number of animals to the land availability of each farm. And I put it in a special color because this is one of the main important things we have to do at the beginning. When we are going to start with this change from the continuous to the regenerative grazing activity. And the second part that we need to know also is the agroclimatic conditions of our farm and the annual growth of the grass and the distribution during the months in the growth of the grass. We introduce our animals to the plots or to the pasture during the vegetative state of the grass because the grass has the higher nutritive quality in those moments. And we do this with grazing calendars, but in the regenerative grazing management, there are many different ways to do this. We can do it with an holistic management, We can do this with a Voisin grazing management, with a rotational management, and each kind of grazing management have different indicators to put the animals in the plots and to take them out. For example, the pasture height or the pasture phenology, the beginning of the flowering or the beginning of the heating. And once we know all this, we start working. So if we do it properly, livestock obtain feed, a place to exercise and place to rest. But the most important thing is that if we do it properly, soil and pasture are fertilized by livestock and plants are reseeded by trampling with the animals. And all those effects are obtained by avoiding all the machines I show you in the pictures, just by livestock. Okay? And even all these aspects are homogeneously in all the plots. So we started with those practices in 2013. So I show you this picture. This is our farm. The block is in the middle. We have 3 main paddocks to graze during spring milking period. I show you there the paddock 1, paddock 2, and paddock 3. Naker is at 600 meters above sea level. And we have an average annual rainfall of 700 millimeters. And our flock was divided in 2 groups in 2013. And our 3 paddocks of pasture were divided also to manage them under regenerative grazing and under continuous grazing. And we compared those 2 kinds of management in grazing since 2013 until this year. So focusing on the grazing calendars, the main important aspect is the resting time. As I show you in this table, the resting time in the continuous grazing plots is 15 days on average, but in the case of the regenerative grazing is 24 days. And that is the main key. So we have worked in 3 different projects. We started in 2013 with live grazing farming project, funded by an European life call. After that, we worked with Naker funds, and finally, those 2 last years, we are working with ETA Food funds. And I'm going to summarize the objectives and the results of each of the parts. The objective in 2013, when we started with live grazing farming project, was to try to demonstrate that the regenerative grazing was a sustainable livestock management alternative in our conditions in the Basque Country. So in that case, we monitored soil, vegetation, and livestock parameters, as I show you there in the table. And summarizing the results, we concluded in that project that carbon was fixed, especially in the regenerative grazing plots. Also, we increased soil fertility. In the case of the vegetation, we increased significantly grass yield, but also plant diversity. And in the case of the livestock, there were no differences in the milk yield of the ewes, but the carbon footprint of the milk was reduced 10%. So once the LIFE project was finished, we continue with our own funds. And in this case, the objective was to measure the ecosystem services that were provided by the regenerative grazing in a mid-term period. So in this case, we focused our study in a paper published by Vogel et al. In 2019, which says that the main ecosystem services provided by pastures-based agroecosystems were those 5. The grass yield that we measured with exclusion cages, the carbon fixation that we measured with carbon and organic matter, the nutrient cycling that we measured by enzyme activity, the plant and soil biodiversity that we measured in the plant case with transect and in the soil case with DNA sequencing, and the water retention capacity. So according to this work, we published this paper in Ecological Indicators Journal. And the main results were that in soil, we increased significantly carbon fixation, soil fertility, and water retention capacity, but we didn't find differences in nutrient cycling or in soil biodiversity. In this case, we confirm that this kind of management, the regenerative grazing management, is a carbon farming management because carbon is captured and removed from the atmosphere and stored in plant and in soil. In the case of the vegetation, we confirmed again that we have an significant increase in grass yield, grazing time, and the nutritive quality of this pasture was better than the continuous grazing one. And last year, we started working with EAT Food funds. The objective of this last work was to determine what kind of carbon fraction are we fixing, and also to determine the product quality under the regenerative grazing management. So in this case, we sampled soil samples at 2 different depths of soil, and we studied the organic carbon, the carbon associated to microbial biomass, the particulated organic matter, the organic matter associated to mineral layer. We continue studying the pasture yield and quality, and in the case of the product quality, we did 2 different approximations. The first one, in the case of the dairy sheep of Naker, we compared milk from regenerative grazing use and milk from the continuous grazing use. And on the other hand, we compared a commercial farm that was pilot of EAT Food. It was dairy cattle farm, and we compared the regenerative farming with an indoor traditional commercial farm, also in the Basque Country. In this case, we focused our study mainly in the fatty acid profile, grouping the saturated fatty acids, the monounsaturated fatty acids, and as positive fatty acids for human health that were polyunsaturated fatty acids, conjugated linoleic acid, and the omega-3. As results of this study, we confirmed that the main carbon we are fixing under our regenerative grazing practices are organic carbon and particulated organic matter, but also in lower level, but the other two carbon fractions also. So in this case, we are thinking about carbon credits, carbon market. This is I think I wanted to put in table in this webinar, because I think it's an important thing that when we started in 2013, nobody talked about carbon credits or carbon market. But now I think it's one of the keys we have to study. And in the case of the product quality, we observed that in the case of Naker, with our dairy sheep flock, there were not huge differences in the fatty acid profile of regenerative or continuous grazing milk, but there are huge differences in the commercial farms when we compare the regenerative farm with an indoor fed farm. In this case, the regenerative milk have very much quantity of polyunsaturated fatty acids, conjugated linoleic acid, and omega-3. And I wanted to show also the opportunity of this kind of products, because there are some initiatives. For example, the Savory Institute have a label that try to verify with those labels I show you here, the land to market. They try to label those regenerative products. It can be milk or it can be meat also. So I wanted to show this also here in the webinar. And finally, this year we are going to follow with the study with EAT Food with 5 dairy farm pilots here in Spain, monitoring soil parameters, but also milk characteristics. And just to summarize my presentation, I wanted to show that with the regenerative grazing, I try to encourage our farmers, saying that with the regenerative grazing, we are carbon farming, that we have an opportunity with carbon market, that also we are increasing soil fertility and ecosystem services by reducing carbon footprint of milk in this case, that we are improving the product quality, and there are some initiatives to label these products. And in general, when we are talking about health, I think we are talking, when regenerative grazing is practicing, we are talking about One Health, talking about soil, pasture, animal, but also consumer health. And under our conditions in the Basque Country, the ups and downs of the regenerative agriculture or regenerative grazing, I think that our farmers have a huge opportunity for the future with this management, but we have mainly two difficulties. The first one is the land availability, I told you before, and the other one is the need of training, but not only the training of farmers, but also of the technicians and the advisors. They work with our farmers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Neria, for great presentations, and thank you for bringing us, how the ecosystems services are in direct relation to animal welfare and consequently human health. We were just discussing the other day about how more tasteful these animals are and how better the milk is, but definitely we need some studies that actually measure and show that in terms of nutrition there are improvements. And you have definitely conducted a very comprehensive study focusing a lot of different aspects, not only from regeneration, but also to nutrition, ecosystem service. And of course, you also pointed to a very important market that is about to explode, the carbon farming and the carbon credits, which will hopefully be also an important part for farmers' revenues and, kind of an incentive towards this regenerative practice. So we will definitely welcome, such studies. I believe that we already have a request from our audience. If you could share with us the link of these publications, so we can check, on the absolute values of the soil chemical parameters. So Neria, if you don't mind. And thank you. And I will start also here with a question from José, who would like a little bit more context on your research. Is it well distributed or highly seasonal, as unluckily we are here in central Portugal? So how is the distribution of rain across the year?
We have two main rainfall periods, one in the spring and the other one in the autumn. During winter, our dairy sheep flock is indoor because we are 600 meters above sea level, so we have a lot of freezing days, and not this winter, but many winters we have many days of snow.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's slightly different from our region. Neria, how did you determine carbon fixation? Which methods did you use? This is a $1 million question. How do you monitor and measure carbon sequestration?
We have the same question, and that's the reason, because last year we measured different carbon fractions because we didn't know which one is the most important one. So we started measuring just the organic matter. After that, we measured particulate organic matter. And last year, we measured also the organic matter associated to the microbial activity and to the soil.
In Spanish.
Easier. Sorry, I tell you now. To the mineral layer of the soil.
And sorry, is the carbon management all the same, or do you take into considerations eventual different practices on the farm, or is it always the same baseline?
We have the same baseline, and I tell you before, all the time we're comparing the two grazing managements, the continuous grazing with the regenerative one, and all the differences I have shown you have been the comparison of the two managements.
Okay, so the baseline is always the same. Okay, thank you. I now have a question from Jose, and Jose is asking, is the regenerative grazing management using the same methods as the holistic management proposed by Alan Savory, or are there any differences?
There are some different details. The three main keys that use small plots, introduce high stocking rates, and give enough resting time, that's for any kind of grazing management. Those keys are for all of them, but the differences are in the details of the indicators, when to introduce livestock, when to take them out. Okay, each teacher has its own book. We say it in Spain, I don't know.
Okay, so you followed your own approach, you see that it worked and you adapted to your local context.
Yeah, we started with the holistic management in our case. But after the years, we are learning and we are improving our way and our calendars and.
Okay, so thank you, Neria. I think this is, that's what everyone says. This is a process of also learning and understanding your environment and adapting and, adjusting the tools. So one final question, Neria. Do you think carbon crediting schemes are not limiting farmers to also contribute to other regenerative objectives besides carbon alone? Are they, just focusing on carbon sequestration?
Yeah, I think the regenerative agriculture have a lot of ecosystem services, but none of them are measured to pay farmers. And carbon is one that is starting to think about paying. So I think one of the aspects that encourage farmers is the way they can earn more money or take more funds from their activity. If any other ecosystem service was measured like carbon, I don't know, for example, water retention capacity or biodiversity, nobody talks about biodiversity credits, but it could be possible. Or water retention capacity credits, and nobody talks about that. Everybody's focused on carbon.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's easier to measure. We were discussing the other day about the benefits of pollinators, and one of the producers was just saying, well, just show me and measure, give me measures in terms of monetary money, how much this pollination system values. And I said, well, we don't have those sorts of studies. So you're absolutely right. It's probably the easiest entry point. And just to finalize there, it was very interesting also from your study that you reach the same amount of productivity in terms of outcome of milk. The experience that we have here in Portugal is normal that these practices decrease significant the amount of milk produced. Better quality, sure, but in terms of the number of liters per cow, it's significantly reduced compared to very intensive grazing systems. So that's interesting.
There is no differences because I compare the continuous grazing in front of the regenerative grazing. I don't compare it with intensive indoor system.
Okay.
So you understand?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I'm comparing all the time the two groups, but the two groups are grazing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, makes sense. It makes sense. Okay. Okay, Neria, that was a great presentation. Thank you very much. Let's see if we can have some time at the end to answer a few more questions. I will now pass to our third speaker. So let me introduce you, EIT Food Program Manager, Philip Fernandez. Philip will be presenting case studies from Spain. So just before passing the floor to Philip, let me just present you Philip. So Philip is working on an ambitious project to help European farmers transition to regenerative agriculture, and very important also to raise awareness among consumers about the environment and health benefits of sustainability produced food. Though Philip has worked in very diverse fields as a lawyer, banker, and a conference interpreter, the recurring theme in his professional career has always been business creation. And prior to joining EIT Food, he founded and then managed a company that exported organic produce from Spain to the Northern Europe, and which later developed into the largest organic food home delivery service in Madrid. So well done, Philip. Thank you so much for being here. So I now give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and the entire team of Food for Sustainability for this invitation and to be able to share our project and hopefully what will be seen as some of our successes. And in this presentation, I guess it's titled "The Ups and Downs of Regenerative Agriculture." I think in the presentation I'll focus more on the ups, but I'd be happy to answer questions about the challenges after the presentation. Let me share my screen. Let's see. I wanted to talk about some cases of successful regenerative practices, some of the studies that we've been doing, carrying out with partners such as Naked and University of Hohenheim, and some case studies we've done on farms that have transitioned from conventional to regenerative agriculture. But before, I just want to give you a little bit of context about the EIT Food program. This is our second year. We started the program around this time in 2020, and basically the project is divided or made up of four different but related components. The main focus, of course, is on farmer training and advice. Since we started, we've organized 14 training courses in 4 European countries, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Poland. And through these courses, we reached approximately 280 farmers. After these courses, we choose the most promising projects to participate in an advisory program where the farmers assigned a regenerative agriculture expert that helps them in this complex transition from conventional organic farming to regenerative farming. There are about 75 farms that are currently enrolled in this program, and we are monitoring on these farms a series of parameters related to soil health, biodiversity, farm management, and hopefully this year we'll be able to start analyzing food nutrition as well. As Claudia says, at EIT Food, we're very much concerned about raising the awareness of consumers about the health and environmental benefits of regenerative agriculture. So we invest quite a bit of money and time on videos, on a blog, sharing articles about the successful stories of the regenerative agriculture pioneers. So this is maybe it's a bit presumptuous to refer to this as a success story since we still don't have results, but for us it's an achievement to have been able to establish a methodology and take the baseline measurements on these 75 farms that are enrolled in the advisory program. So what we have done is basically gather information from 3 different types of sources. The first being a visual soil assessment tool, which we make available to all the farmers on the program. This is information that can be recorded on a cell phone, and these are measurements that the farmers themselves can perform. So it's a very important function for us because, first of all, this makes farmers aware of the importance of soil health and biodiversity to farming, to regenerative agriculture. But then it also is its primary role is it's a tool to farmers. This is a tool that they can use, and they can use it as frequently or in as many places on the farm as they want. Basically, what we're looking for here is about 15 different parameters that they can measure. It has to do with things like earthworm count, root depth and density, water infiltration rates, soil color, different parameters that we believe are very good proxies for biodiversity and soil health and soil organic matter. And then these baseline measurements were taken at the end of last year, actually by a young agronomist who will participate in Food for Sustainability's next webinar, and she can explain how this project, how she carried out this project. But very, very ambitious. She traveled all across the Iberian Peninsula to the most remote areas of Spain to gather this information and train farmers on how to use the tool. Then, of course, we took soil samples and sent them to a lab for physical chemical analysis. This is a typical lab analysis where we're looking at things like the pH, cation exchange, the different macronutrients, trace elements. And so we record all this information, and this helps, first of all, the farmer. At the end of we interpret this lab data and turn it into a report with recommendations to the farmer and the agronomist who's advising the farmer, so we can see what nutrients are missing in the soil and make the amendments that are necessary. Again, it's also important for us as a baseline because every year we'll take soil samples, and we are hoping that after 3 years we could prove to the people in Brussels that regenerative agriculture is contributing, improving soil health and creating soil organic matter. Finally, we're looking at some economic indicators as well. Basically, we kind of deduce farm profitability from yields and expenses, what the farmers are spending on farming inputs, and I'll go into detail later on this in one of the projects that we did. So these are this is the three sources of information, and like I said, we have these baseline measurements, and we'll be tracking these over, I think, about 60 different parameters over the next 3 years. It's a bit of overkill, but as Nerea was mentioning in her presentation, we don't know what's going to be important, right? I mean, in case of carbon, there's many different ways of measuring carbon. Same here, there's many different things that we can measure, and we just want to make sure that 3 years down the line, someone tells us, oh, you forgot to do this. So we're trying to be as comprehensive as possible. So one of the first great news that we got was a study that we concluded at the end of last year. It started at the end of 2020. We worked with the ITACIL, the Technological Agrarian Institute of Castile and Leon. And basically the project, what our objective was to compare the nutrient density or the nutritional value of grass-fed beef to conventional beef, similar to what Naked was doing with milk. And we expected that the pasture-fed beef would be more nutritious, but actually the results were much more spectacular and dramatic than we expected. It was an interesting study. We worked with 15 different livestock operations across the Iberian Peninsula, different ecosystems, different breeds of cattle, different ages, but the common denominator was that all the cows in the study were fed exclusively on grass. And again, we compare these to the conventional counterpart. And just to summarize, I'm not a nutritional expert like Nerea, but similar to what she studied with the milk. We were looking at the fatty acid components and the percentages, and the conclusion was that in grass-fed beef, the fat portions of fatty acids were much healthier than in conventional beef. The important ratios were polyunsaturated over monounsaturated fats. So the higher this fraction, the better for our cardiovascular system. Grass-fed beef had much lower levels of monounsaturated fats. Also very high levels of omega-3, similar to almost to seafood. This was the most spectacular finding. The recommended level is below 4, and in grass-fed beef we're getting very, very low levels in this fraction of omega-6 to omega-3, and this is basically due to the higher levels of omega-3. And then conjugated linoleic acid, which has a lot of very beneficial effects on human health. Again, this had very high levels as well. Another thing we've been studying is, since we don't have the results from a year's worth of practice, representative practices in these 75 farms, we have spoken to some of the agronomists that are on our team, and they have done case studies on the farms that they've worked with over the last 2 years. This isn't representative. Like I said, we're hoping that when we get 75 farms, we can get averages and see things that are more representative. But here, this was a case of a peach farm in northern Spain, irrigated, and the results were really spectacular. I think it's important for us this business model has to be profitable for farmers. We can't, in good faith, encourage farmers to transition to regenerative agriculture if they're going to lose money. So for us, it's important that they make money, and the only way that we believe they can do it in the short term is by lowering their costs, because right now, there's a lot of talk about carbon credits, and that's something that hopefully will take effect very shortly, and the farmers will be able to get compensated for these ecosystem services, or maybe other ones like we're talking about biodiversity. There's a market premium for regenerative produce, but it's a very small market, and not most people don't even know what regenerative agriculture is or where to find it. So we don't think in the short term that farmers are going to be able to get a price premium for their produce. There are some exceptions to this. Farmers that are very active in production and in commercial side and everything, but that's again very, very difficult for the typical farmer. So what we strive to do is reduce their input cost, and in this case, it was dramatic. Basically, the way that this is achieved is by reducing the purchase of chemical inputs. And here you can see the figures. Let me just put on my glasses. The fertilizers before the growing season was brought way down. Also in the drip irrigation, and probably the most decisive factor was eliminating the use of pesticides and herbicides. A lot of farmers are under the mistaken impression, well, if I'll just, in case something bad happens, I'll just apply all the toxic products that I can think of and to prevent them from happening. This isn't necessary. And instead of this, on this farm, what the advisor recommended was to apply microbiology, which, as you can see, is much less expensive than the nitrogen synthetic fertilizers, and it's actually a reduction. And this is something exceptional, but there was a reduction of over 400% in cost. Also, should point out, and this is important as well, in advising farmers, there's an ideal, want to implement as many regenerative practices as possible, but you're dealing with farmers that are often conservative. They don't understand this system. It's very complex. And so a lot of them, it has to be a gradual process. So here, these were the only changes to the farm. The no cover crops were applied. Livestock was not integrated. but we got these results simply by changing chemical fertilizers and reducing phytosanitary products and increasing the microbiology. And these are the results. What was most surprising was the increase in yield. Again, this is representative, but there was an increase in the yield, and it primarily had to do, on the one hand, this doesn't have to do with regenerative agriculture, it had to do with better, more rational pruning. The theory is that if you have more vegetation, the more photosynthesis, the more solar energy converted into sugars and it goes into the soil, improving microbiology, and more sugar for the plant itself, and thus more fruit. A lot of farmers prune too much and they lose all that photosynthetic capacity. So here we saw this considerable increase in yield. So yeah, those we've also done a similar study for avocados. The results weren't quite as impressive as this case of the peach farm. The yields remained the same or slightly decreased, and there was about a 50% decrease in the farmer's cost. So again, our hope is that by March we'll be doing the second lab analysis of the soil. Next fall we'll be doing the second round of visual soil assessments and be able to have results to see exactly if what we're doing is effective or not. It isn't a scientific study as the ones we've seen. It's because we're not controlling all the variables. We're dealing with 75 farmers in different ecosystems, over 12 different crops, not all, implementing different practices, different combinations of practices, but hopefully we'll be able to see whether through implementation of 1 to 3 regenerative practices, whether we'll see improvements in soil organic matter and farm profitability. So yeah, that's basically what we're doing. I think it's much better to be happy to answer questions and again, or talk about the challenges we faced with the audience. Thank you very much, Claudia.
Thank you, Philip, and let me congratulate you on the great work that you've been doing. It's just 2 years, and it seems like you've been, you don't sleep and you don't eat, probably.
I've aged 5 years.
Because you have achieved a lot, and I think, Philip, this is the starting point for very important studies, and hopefully you can follow on and learn more about the consistency of these results to see how they perform over time. We'll be checking on you on follow-ups from this project. But well done. But can you give us some details about the farms? What sort of sizes and crops, and are they? Is it they are just transitioning? Is it their first year, or they were they already had some, I don't know, like cover crops or some practices that were already pointing to regeneration?
To tell through it couldn't be more diverse. We're working with farms all over Spain and Italy and in southern Portugal, from, like I said, over 12 different crops. Farm size can range from 7 hectares to 500 hectares. We're working on dairy farms. We have olive, almond, row crops. Yeah, a bit of everything. In terms of the type of farming, typically in these the first 2 years, the people that we're reaching are farmers that tend to have some interest in sustainability. So inquietud, there's some concern about the environment and desire to do things better and differently. So a lot of the farmers maybe about 40% of the farmers are already practicing organic agriculture, for example. Some of them, maybe 20%, even have begun to transition to regenerative agriculture, but they're kind of at a loss. It is a complex transition. It's a change in mindset, and it involves a lot of trial and error. So it's difficult, and the farmers they're looking for this knowledge, for this advice. As you mentioned earlier, one of the big needs is knowledge sharing. So that's kind of what we're trying to encourage. And we have in Spain and Italy, we have a team of 12 experts in regenerative agriculture. We believe they're some of the best in Europe, and each with especially different expertise in different crops and different types of practices.
Yes, that's interesting, and probably it might be one of the reasons that sets apart from the study that Lockie presented earlier, that it could be that this baseline is slightly different. So we are departing from a soil that probably is not so contaminated, so it's probably in better shape, and eventually it could be that the profile of farmers, smaller farmers here in the Peninsula Iberia, smaller farmers, more familiar farmers could also, show more concerns about some of this sustainability. Philip, just before I go to our participants, a lot of the practices that we have here in Portugal, they also deal with the cattle and the holistic management. But one of the main concerns that we hear, it's about the ability to valorize their products close to the consumers. So we do have a lot of farmers that have these excellent practices, but then they end up selling their meat as conventional meat. You mentioned that within EIT Food, you are also doing some work with consumers. Could you let us know a little bit more what the program involves from the consumer's perspective? What sort of work do you think we still need to be doing towards consumers?
Well, what we're doing with regard to consumer awareness and on the demand side of this equation is pretty general right now. It's simply communication campaigns. I encourage people to look at YouTube. We have a series of 6 videos now that explain regenerative agriculture, explain our program, and now we're focusing on stories of regenerative farmers, and they explain their journey, what they're doing, what their challenges are, and what their successes are. So it's very general. It is a problem. It's a big problem. You mentioned that. That's why I mentioned now our focus is on reducing costs, because we don't know when farmers will be able to sell their beef as regenerative, and we're not even clear whether it's something that's good to have a regenerative label as an organic label. That's a whole nother debate, whether that's something useful or whether it can create more problems than benefits. Mm-hmm. I think ultimately what we need to strive for, what a lot of our research is aimed at, is understanding the health benefits and the environmental benefits. And rather than having a label or a huge bureaucracy and an inspection process, if we can simply show consumers quickly and effectively how this produce, this beef, has improved the soil, let's say increased soil organic matter by 1% in a year or whatever, and that this is the nutritional value of this food, get that immediate information in the grocery store on the shelf, that will do much more than a certification or a label. So that's kind of where we're striving for now.
Yes, Philip, and let me suggest start to do some tastings. We also have good wine in Portugal and Spain, so probably could be a good way to start convincing consumers to look towards regenerative produce. Let me turn to our audience. So I have a question here about business models. Can you elaborate why you think we need to use subsidies to compensate the extra cost of farmers instead of letting the consumer pay, for example, price premiums?
Well, first of all, I think that for me, the ideal world would be what's called true cost accounting. And there's a lot of talk about this recently, and basically the concept is rather than paying a premium or what's perceived as a subsidy to regenerative farmers who are actually contributing to improving the environment, producing healthier food, rather than doing that, simply make producers that are polluting the environment, producing less nutritious food, make them pay for those costs which are now external. So if you have a industrial feedlot that's contaminating the watersheds, putting lots of methane in the atmosphere, producing tons of waste, well, I have these producers pay for those costs, and those costs would in turn be transferred to the consumer. So conventionally produced beef from industrial feedlots would be more expensive than the regenerative beef. So for me, that's kind of the solution. In the meantime, is that realistic? That can happen short term? Probably not. But if we can convey, like I said, the health and environmental benefits of regenerative produce to consumers, I think many are willing to pay a premium. Right now, there's a minority that will pay, I think, for the environmental benefits, which are clear. Our goal is to be able to demonstrate the health benefits, because we believe that'll open up a much bigger market, let's say 10% to 40, 50%. So that's kind of what we're striving for.
Let's do our work towards that. Philip, Jose is quite curious about how you apply microbiology. So you mentioned that you do some, instead of chemical fertilizer, you apply some microbiology. So what is this?
I should clarify, I'm not an agronomist. Like I said, I was a lawyer and a banker. So, but basically in the training courses and what the agronomists recommend is that a lot of these are fermentados, o sea, these are microbiology that the farmers can make themselves on their farm with very, very basic ingredients. So that's one option. And then a lot of it, there's biofertilizers that are also available on the market. But basically, this is a kind of like a jump start applying microbiology, because in the long term, the idea is that through cover crops, through integration of livestock, that this microbiology will grow, be generated naturally in the soil.
Okay, good. Thank you. So we have another question from Raul. And Raul asks, is there a specific profile of farmers interested in joining regenerative agriculture programs, or seems that it is a general concern of the sector? So, the ones that come to you, Philip, farmers, is there a specific profile?
Yeah, that's kind of like I was saying before. I think most of them are farmers that are currently concerned about the environment and want to explore a different and better way of doing things, to see that the current system doesn't work. Either it doesn't make money, it doesn't make sense to apply products that are toxic, to spend more and more. I think this year, there's a tremendous crisis in the countryside right now because of the increase in synthetic fertilizers that have tripled in price. All the farm inputs are increasing. The farmers may not know anything about regenerative agriculture, but they have to start looking. They have no recourse. So, and also for us, it's important for us to have a real impact, environmental impact. We need to kind of go beyond preaching to the convinced, which is very important. They're the pioneers. They're the ones that are going to set the example. But to extend these practices throughout Southern Europe, we have to going to reach conventional farmers. So we're looking ways to reach a wider audience.
Okay, well, it's important to identify these early adopters, so they can then demonstrate to the others. So we have a couple of more technical questions. I might just pick one last question. Try not to be too detailed, too technical for you, Philip.
Okay.
So Philip congratulates you on the results, and he asks, how much of a role do you think biochar can play in regenerative agriculture? I don't know if I picked a very technical one.
That's fine. I think it's important. I mean, it's actually I'm working on another project called Test Farms, and we work with startups that are producing biochar with microorganisms, and it's a good way of improving microbiology in very poor soils. We did they tested their product on an olive grove in Andalusia near Seville, an intensive olive grove with horrible soil, and we saw considerable improvements in one season in the fertility of the soil. So yeah, it's a good solution.
It's a possibility. Okay, thank you
Actually,
very
it's a
much.
Portuguese company.
Okay, good. I don't think we can disclaim here for commercial reasons, but okay, thank you very much. I think we need to call it an end. We are a little bit over time already. I would like to thank our presenters and especially also our audience for being here. I hope you have enjoyed our webinar. Philip was a bit of a spoiler telling us what's coming next, but that's fine. Don't worry.
Sorry.
No worries. It's all available on our website. I'm just joking. But next week we'll have 3 farmers, so actually people that are already implementing regenerative agriculture. So you can please join us and ask your question and raise concerns about things that work and things that don't work. And thank you again for being here and joining us with this debate on regenerative and making, clarifying the term and what are the ups and downs of this new concept and this new way of looking at agriculture. So I wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope to see you again next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.